Whether you're a bioprocess engineer hunting for the perfect scaled-down model, a biotech founder architecting the leap to commercialization, or a scientific analyst who craves raw technical truth, you've reached the technical edge. In this space, we live by a single mantra: the process is the product. Welcome to the Biomanufacturing and Fermentation Technology podcast with Prasad Ernala. Hit subscribe and ring the bell to join a global community and stay at the vanguard of biotech translation. Let's build the bioindustrial future together.
Welcome to the debate. In the high-stakes world of biotechnology, there is a tragedy that plays out with depressing regularity. You have a company that has spent, say, 5 years and $50 million developing a breakthrough therapy. The science works, the platform is valid, but the corporate vehicle, the company itself, it just runs out of gas. Maybe it's a bad capital structure, a market downturn, or, just poor timing. In a sane world, we would have a mechanism to lift that valuable science out of the broken vehicle and put it into a new one. But in our current system, we just don't. The company crashes and the science, along with the team who understands it, is effectively liquidated and destroyed. Today, we're debating a controversial fix: enabling IP-Centric Restructuring and so-called NewCo formation. We're asking if policy should actively help spin these assets out before the ship sinks.
It is a fascinating proposal, but I think we need to be very, very precise about what you're actually suggesting. Because to the average observer, and certainly to a creditor, what you're describing looks a lot like asset stripping. You're talking about taking the valuable things, the IP, the data, the star scientists, moving them into a clean, debt-free lifeboat called a NewCo, and leaving all the invoices, the lawsuits, and the mistakes on the sinking ship. The central question isn't just about saving science. It's whether we're willing to rewrite the fundamental rules of debt and property rights to do it.
That's the cynical interpretation, certainly. But I'm coming at this from the perspective of innovation preservation. The reality is that biotech assets are not like other assets. If a furniture factory goes bankrupt, the saws and the wood are still there 6 months later. You can sell them at auction. In biotech, the asset is tacit knowledge. It's fragile. If you wait for the slow, grinding gears of a traditional bankruptcy process, the asset just evaporates. I'm arguing that our policy needs to recognize that speed is an innovation necessity here. We need to lower the barriers to restructuring so that the data and the team can survive the death of the parent company.
Okay, I understand the fragility argument. I really do, but I come at it from a position of market discipline. We have bankruptcy codes for a reason. They're designed to ensure fairness, to ensure that the electric company, the landlord, and the early investors get whatever scraps are left. I'm highly skeptical of any framework that prioritizes the abstract good of science over the concrete contractual rights of the people who funded the risk in the first place. If we make failure too comfortable, if we make it too easy to hit the reset button, we encourage moral hazard. We risk creating a landscape of, zombie companies that just shed their skin every 2 years to escape their debts.
I think comfortable is the wrong word. No founder wants their company to fail. But let's dig into your point about the bankruptcy code. You're right that it ensures fairness for physical assets, but my core argument, and the argument in the source material, is that the current code is functionally obsolete for intangible process know-how.
Okay, hang on. Intangible process know-how. That sounds like jargon. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think of it this way. A patent is often described as a recipe. But in complex biologics or industrial fermentation, the patent is just the list of ingredients. It doesn't tell you how the chef holds the knife or exactly how the dough feels when the humidity changes. That is the tacit knowledge. It lives in the heads of the team. If a company enters a standard Chapter 11 process, legal paralysis sets in. The funding stops, the payroll stops. The scientists, who are highly employable, they leave immediately.
And once they leave, the recipe is useless?
Exactly. The transferability of the IP collapses. You might still own the patent, but you cannot reproduce the result without the troubleshooting logic that the team developed over years. So by forcing the company through a slow, creditor-centric liquidation, you are actually destroying the value for everyone. The creditors end up with a worthless patent portfolio that sells for pennies, whereas a structured spin-out into a NewCo could have preserved that value.
I accept the premise that the team is part of the asset. However, you seem to be using that fact to justify
what sounds like a gun-to-the-head negotiation strategy. You're essentially telling the creditors, let us move this asset into a new co immediately on our terms, or the asset will be worth zero.
It's not a threat. It's a description of reality.
But legally, it walks a very fine line. We have concepts like fraudulent conveyance. You can't just transfer an asset out of an insolvent company for less than its fair value to keep it away from creditors. If a board moves a $10 million technology into a new co for $100,000 just to save the team, that's fraud. My concern is that your proposal for speed is just a way to bypass the scrutiny that determines what that asset is actually worth.
And that brings us to the hard blockers. Right now, boards are paralyzed by exactly what you just said. They're terrified of personal liability. They know the ship is sinking, they know the science is valuable, but they freeze because they don't want to be sued for preferential treatment 3 years later by a trustee. So they do nothing. The company hits the wall and the science dies. The proposal here is to create safe harbor periods.
Safe harbor. Lawyers love that term. It usually means immunity.
Well, in this context, it means a clear, predefined pathway. If a board follows specific steps, independent valuation, open bidding, standard terms, they should be allowed to execute a spin-out to a new co without the looming threat of retroactive litigation. We need to give them the confidence to act while the patient is still alive on the table.
I'm not convinced. A safe harbor can very easily become a shield for incompetence. If we grant boards immunity to strip assets because they claim they're saving the science, we remove the accountability for the business failure. And I have to ask, if this science is so incredibly valuable, why is the company failing in the first place?
Usually it's the capital structure. Or maybe a clinical trial failed for indication A, but the platform is perfect for indication B. But nobody will fund that pivot because the company is drowning in debt.
But markets are efficient, usually. If the platform is perfect for indication B, why aren't private investors bridging the gap? If I'm a VC and I see a dollar selling for 50 cents, I buy it. If the private market refuses to fund this MUCO or bridge the old company, that might be a valid market signal that the technology actually isn't viable. You're asking policy to override that signal.
It's not that the market rejects the technology. The market rejects the friction. Investors hate entanglement. They don't want to put fresh millions into a company where that money might get seized by a landlord or a previous lender. They want a clean slate. My argument is that policy should facilitate that clean slate so the market can actually judge the science on its merits, rather than on the previous company's messy cap table.
So essentially, you want to make it easier to ditch the baggage. But that baggage belongs to someone. That debt is someone's pension fund or someone's vendor invoice. But all right, let's look at the mechanics you're proposing. The material discusses the role of public funding in this.
Yes, and this addresses the question, who pays for the funeral? One of the most interesting proposals is that funding agencies, like the NIH or similar bodies who often fund the basic research, should treat restructuring feasibility as a paid, auditable deliverable.
Wait, clarify that. You want the taxpayer who effectively paid for the research in the first place via a grant to now pay for the lawyers to clean up the private company's mess?
Not the mess, the transition. Think about institutional memory. When a biotech startup fails chaotically, all the negative data, the knowledge of what didn't work, is lost. We effectively pay for the next startup to make the same mistakes. The proposal is to use small targeted funding to create spin-out templates.
Templates I can understand. Standardizing the paperwork.
Exactly. Based on WIPO guidance. Right now, when a spin-out happens, it can take 6 months of negotiation just to define background IP versus foreground IP. Who owns the data? Who owns the cell line? While lawyers argue, the cash runs out. If we had pre-approved, government-endorsed templates for these definitions, we could execute the restructuring in weeks.
I'm a fan of reducing transaction costs. If WIPO or a government agency can provide a standard form that defines IP boundaries, that's a public good. But I do worry about the funding aspect. If you start paying companies to plan their own restructuring, are you incentivizing them to give up?
No, you're incentivizing them to be resilient. It's disaster recovery planning. It's ensuring that the public's investment in the basic science isn't lost just because the business model failed.
I'll concede that templates are useful, but if we use them, they need teeth. They can't just be a fast lane for the assets. They must include what I would call governance minimums and investor conversion mechanics.
And what do you mean by conversion mechanics in this context?
I mean, we need a standard formula for how the old shareholders get treated. We can't have a template where the CEO and the new investor just decide the IP is worth 0, transfer it to themselves, and the old shareholders get wiped out. The template must mandate transparency in how that exchange ratio is calculated.
I completely agree. In fact, that transparency is the only way to get around the biggest practical hurdle identified in the research: investor consent. This is the veto deadlock, and I think this is where we might disagree most strongly.
The famous blocking rights.
Here's the scenario. You have a company with 10 different investors. The company is failing. A white knight investor offers to fund a new co to save the technology, but they demand a clean cap table. 9 investors say yes. 1 investor, maybe a legacy holder who is angry about the valuation, says no. They hold a contractual veto. Because of that one no, the deal dies, the company liquidates, and everyone gets 0.
And you want to strip that investor of their veto.
I want structured exit options. I argue that a single minority investor should not have the power to kill a viable innovation that could save lives simply because they prefer a tax write-off or are holding out for a better price that doesn't exist.
I have to stop you there. I'm sorry. But I just don't buy that we can waive away contractual rights because they're inconvenient for the rescue plan. That investor bought a property right. They paid for the right to say no. Maybe they believe the restructuring is a bad deal. Maybe they think the management team is trying to steal the company. You cannot just legislate away their leverage without destroying the trust that allows early-stage investing to happen in the first place.
But is their leverage serving the economic good? It's a dog in the manger situation. They can't save the company themselves, but they won't let anyone else save it either. This is why I propose differentiated consent thresholds.
Meaning you just lower the voting requirements?
For specific actions, yes. For example, the vote required to move the IP into a preservation vehicle, a holding tank essentially, should be lower than the vote required to sell the company. We need to separate preservation from valuation. Let's move the asset to safety first with a simple majority, and then we can argue about the price later.
That is a very slippery slope. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Once you move the asset into a new co controlled by the white knight, the legacy investor has lost all their leverage. They will never get a fair price after the fact. I would propose a different mechanism. Rather than stripping rights, we should lean on pay-to-play.
Pay-to-play is already standard, isn't it? If you don't participate in the new round, you get diluted.
Yes, but we can make it more aggressive in these restructuring scenarios. We call it priority protections for new money. If a new investor is willing to put capital into the rescue vehicle, they get super priority, they get paid back first, 2 times or 3 times over before the old money sees a dime. If the legacy investor hates the deal, they're welcome to put in their own money and participate. If they refuse to fund the rescue, they lose their right to block it.
I think that's a fair compromise. It solves the free rider problem where old investors want the upside of the rescue without the risk. But this brings us back to the danger of abuse. If we make it easier to spin these new cos out, whether through templates or lower voting thresholds, we need safeguards. We cannot turn the biotech industry into a shell game.
Absolutely. The source material lists several, but 3 stand out to me as non-negotiable. First and foremost, independent technical validation.
Explain why that's distinct from normal due diligence.
Because in a restructuring, the buyers often have inside information. It's usually the current management or current investors. They know the data is good. They might tell the creditors, oh, this is a long shot, it's worth nothing, while privately knowing it's a gold mine. We need a third-party expert, an academic or a consultant, to certify the technical status of the asset.
That makes sense. It prevents information asymmetry.
Second, transparent valuation methodology. We need an open book formula. If you're transferring a patent portfolio, you can't just pick a number out of the air. You need to show your work. How did you arrive at that price? Was it marketed to others? Was there a bidding process?
And the third?
Limits on serial restructurings. The Phoenix problem.
You mean the company that rises from the ashes every 2 years?
Exactly. We cannot allow a team to burn through $50 million, fail, shed the debt, start a new co, burn another $50 million, fail, and do it again. There has to be a limit. If you restructure once, okay, you're saving the science. If you try to do it a second time with the same asset, no. At that point, the market has spoken. The asset is a lemon.
I would add one more safeguard to that list. Conflict of interest governance. We alluded to this, but it needs to be explicit. If the founders are buying the assets from the dying company, they cannot be the ones voting on the sale price. We need a special committee of independent directors who are not going to the newco to approve the transaction.
That is basic corporate hygiene, yet it's amazingly rare in these panic-driven situations. Transparency is the price of speed. If you want the fast lane that you advocate for, the safe harbors, the quick transfers, you have to drive with the lights on.
I want to zoom out for a minute. We've been very focused on the legal plumbing, debts, cap tables, veto rights, but there's a human and geographic element to this described in the material as cluster dynamics.
You mean the impact on places like Boston or San Francisco or Cambridge?
Exactly. Biotech is an ecosystem. The learning stock, that tacit knowledge we talked about, is embedded in the people. If a company liquidates and the team scatters, that knowledge doesn't just leave the company, it often leaves the cluster. The scientist takes a job in a different industry or moves to a different country. The region loses that density of expertise.
I try to view this with some intellectual charity because I know network effects are real. But there is a counter-argument. If we work too hard to keep a team together in a struggling new co, are we actually hurting the ecosystem?
How could keeping a team together be harmful?
Because efficient markets require talent fluidity. Maybe the best thing for the Boston cluster is for that failing company to die quickly. Then, those 50 brilliant scientists are released back into the pool to be hired by the successful company down the street that's growing. If we fetishize team continuity, we might be trapping talent in zombie companies rather than letting it flow to the best ideas.
That assumes there is a successful company down the street hiring for that exact specialization. Often, in a niche field, there isn't. But more importantly, you risk breaking the equity story.
The equity story?
People in this industry work 80 hours a week. They take lower cash salaries than they could get in big pharma or tech. They do it for the equity, for the chance that their slice of the pie will be worth something. If they see that every time a company hits a bump, the equity goes to zero and the company dissolves, that entire incentive structure breaks.
They stop taking the risk.
Exactly. They stop taking startups. They go to safe corporate jobs. If we allow IP-Centric Restructuring, if we allow the new code to preserve some value for the stakeholders, we keep the dream alive that working for a startup is worth the risk. Preserving the new code preserves the psychological fuel of the cluster.
That's a very strong point. If the equity is always worthless in a downturn, the talent pipeline dries up. But again, it's a balance. We want to preserve the incentive without subsidizing failure.
Currently letting deployable innovation capital rot. Our bankruptcy tools are designed for factories, not for knowledge. By using standardized templates, providing modest public funding for restructuring planning, and creating legal safe harbors, we can transform failure from a dead end into a transition. We can save the science without saving the bad business model.
And I will concede this much. The standard bankruptcy timeline is a death sentence for tacit knowledge. It is a square peg in a round hole. Speed matters. However, I hold firm that we cannot prioritize innovation over obligation. Any policy reform must prioritize creditor fairness and independent validation. If we create a system where it's too easy to ditch the debt and keep the diamond, we will destroy the lending market that supports these companies in the first place.
That's the balance we have to strike. But I think we agree on the fundamental shift. The industry needs to stop viewing restructuring as a dirty secret or a sign of incompetence and start viewing it as a complex, necessary phase of high-risk science.
Agreed. It requires maturity. It requires acknowledging that failure is part of the model and handling that failure with transparency rather than burying it in litigation.
Thank you for listening to the debate. We hope this exchange has illuminated the high stakes of saving science when the business fails.
Indeed. There is always more to explore in the material. We leave it to you to decide, is the risk of moral hazard worth the reward of saved innovation?
Until next time.
Hi there, thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these technical insights help bridge the gap in your own process, please hit subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell Stay connected for our next deep dive into the realities of biomanufacturing. I am Prasad Ernala. Thanks for listening.